Awesome. All right. Welcome to people joining us live or watching this later to another episode of Marie's Bundesliga Minutes. We are broadcasting from New York, and actually, for the first time, my guest is also in New York. Welcome, Grant. Love having you on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I think we're probably about, probably at 2 miles apart from each other, but it's a little easier, I guess, in the Zoom world to do it this way.
Yeah, I'm on the 27th floor, so I'll wave at you from the window. Yeah, so a little bit of background. I was lucky to have Grant come to one of my journalism classes in the spring. My favorite professors at Columbia, Kelly Whiteside and Sean Gregory, invited him, and he spoke to us about sports journalism and his own background in basketball and soccer reporting. And cheeky me, always the networker, just kind of kept in touch. And I'm so grateful that Grant is joining us today. Grant, you've just come back from a long trip. You've seen 3 very different places. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm covering all the U.S. men's national team World Cup qualifiers. So there's 14 of them over about a 6-month period. And I started a new website at grantwahl.com. And so all my work is there. And essentially, I'm covering each game like I used to for Sports Illustrated back in the print magazine days. And so that means writing a magazine quality story about 2,000, 2,500 words that you get the morning after at 9 a.m. Eastern every US game, which takes a lot of effort, but I really enjoy it. And so that meant being at the US-Jamaica game in Austin, Texas, and then at the Panama-USA game in Panama, and then at the US-Costa Rica game in Columbus, Ohio. And it was funny because I actually had another stop to make in Mexico City the day after the game in Austin for a different project. So this was a crazy 8-day trip to Austin, Mexico City, Panama, and Columbus before getting back to New York yesterday. And what I've learned is in doing these stories is on game night, I either pull an all-nighter or I got 2 hours of sleep in Columbus. And it's a lot, but I'm really happy with the way things are looking and what I'm doing. And I've been doing this for a long time. I want to be in the center of the action at the events that are the most important to the soccer fans in the United States.
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, to some of our listeners who may not be following the UN, I hope everyone's following the United Nations, but who are not following the US men's national team, could you do like a quick recap of how these 3 games went and what kind of the learnings were?
Yeah, it ended up being 2 wins and 1 loss for the United States. The 2 home games, they won 2-0 against Jamaica in the first game, and then 2-1 over Costa Rica 2 nights ago. And then in the middle, in Panama, there was a loss, 1-0 to Panama. It was the first time the U.S. men have ever lost to Panama in World Cup qualifying. And so there was a whole range of emotions for U.S. soccer fans in these games. And I get it. I've been doing this for a while, so I understand where the fans are coming from. And the feeling that because the U.S. didn't qualify for the last World Cup, I think there's a bit of a PTSD with fans here. And so anytime there's a loss, it becomes a catastrophe. And look, I get it. But they got 6 points out of 3 games. The U.S. is on track to qualify for the next World Cup. And they have a huge game coming up next against Mexico on November 12th.
Yeah, that's always a thriller, that tie. We all love that tie up. So the game that they did lose, Greg Berhalter, the coach, selected kind of like a reserve team. And I mean, he explained that by saying that, it's 3 games. And I guess that was a calculated risk. But, that was in addition to some key players missing as well. So two of our listeners' favorite players, both of Bundesliga and Dortmund fame, Christian Pulisic and Gio Reyna, couldn't even make the trip. For people who perhaps, like I already said, like don't follow the games live. I mean, it is quite late for Europeans to watch. Among that second or third team, also like the Gold Cup in the summer, who in your opinion are some talents, to really look out for, to keep an eye on?
Are you talking about like a Ricardo Pepi, kind of on that level?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so we started to see some young players emerging on this U.S. men's national team, and maybe even getting more of a chance on this window because Pulisic and Reyna weren't involved. They're both still very young, by the way. So, you say young or emerging talents, but Ricardo Pepi is an 18-year-old center forward who scored 3 goals in 2 U.S. qualifiers, 2 down, or 1 in Honduras and then 2 against Jamaica. And, he's just had a few games, so you don't want to make too many big conclusions yet, but very, very promising player, having a terrific season with FC Dallas in MLS. And he's going to be bought by a significant club in Europe, probably as soon as January, maybe the summer window, we'll see. Brenden Aaronson is another U.S. player who's been playing as a winger, terrific attacking player, just 20 years old, playing right now with Salzburg. So if people who are watching this, listening to this, follow Champions League, Brenden Aaronson is playing and doing well in Champions League right now too. And just part of the assembly line that Salzburg seems to have with emerging talents. And so those are a couple of guys. We did see Chris Richards, who's on loan from Bayern Munich with Hoffenheim, get his first start in World Cup qualifying the other night. Played pretty well, I thought. I'd been waiting for him to get an opportunity, and he finally did. And I do feel like Chris Richards and Miles Robinson are probably the long-term center back tandem for the U.S. I know John Brooks may have something to say about that. He missed this window with a back injury, but those are a few of the guys I would say. And then Yunus Musa is an 18-year-old playing with Valencia in Spain, and he played all 3 games, had 2 good ones in the wins, a not so good one in the loss, and just you have to remind yourself how young some of these players are, because a lot of 18-year-olds and 20-year-olds, and that's one reason why U.S. fans are so excited right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that you picked up Musa there, because he was someone who wasn't really on my radar until this international break, and he was so fun and so daring. I mean, especially for that age, like box to box, just dribbling along.
Yeah.
And I mean, he's one of a few Americans now in La Liga, so it's exciting to see all these talented players kind of scattered across Europe. I know that you actually went on a trip to Germany, I think, was it 2 years ago, to visit some of the capitals of German football and visit some of the Americans out there. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I had a great trip. And that was for about a 40-minute long video for Sports Illustrated that we did. It came out in 2019, but it's free now. If you look up Google Exploring Planet Futbol, we did 4 episodes in different countries like Iceland, Argentina, Japan, and then Germany. And the timing was good. We did a road trip basically around Germany and met up with different emerging U.S. players. So we stopped first in Munich when Chris Richards was with them and interviewed him. Then we went to Leipzig and met up with Tyler Adams and Jesse Marsch. Tyler had just gone over right before that to Leipzig in January of 2019. And Jesse Marsch was, for that season, an assistant coach with Leipzig. So it was right before he went to Salzburg. Now, obviously, he's back at Leipzig as the head coach. Then we went, we made a stop in Berlin, didn't see any players there, but we went to Dortmund and met up with Christian Pulisic. He was sort of in his final days with Dortmund. And we also met up with Weston McKennie when he was at Schalke. So it was a really fun trip. I spent a lot of time in Germany over the years for stories, and it's always a great soccer culture to sort of immerse yourself in, and try to get there as much as I can.
Yeah, I mean, like outside of going to the stadiums, and that's for anyone who hasn't been, is very fun in Germany because you can drink beer like actually in the ranks, and kind of you're very likely to get a beer shower if your team scores. But like outside of the actual stadium experience, were there any cities that really like impressed you in terms of their like day-to-day football culture?
I mean, all of them. I mean, seriously, it's kind of crazy. I mean, in every city, like one thing that it took me a while to figure out about Germany was how different the different regions are in Germany, and they all have sort of their own identities, and it was really interesting for me to experience those different things. With like in terms of the culture, I mean, like from a soccer perspective, like it's just constant, like the media culture, and whether it's television, the newspapers. I unfortunately don't speak German, so I'm not getting the full exposure, I think. But and it was also interesting for me to go to Berlin and spend a couple days there, because Berlin is this fascinating international city, and yet it's not so much of a traditional pro soccer city in Germany. And what I learned that I didn't know before I made my trip was how big amateur soccer is in Berlin. And so just talking to people there, I visited my friend Musa Okwanga, who's a terrific writer who lives in Berlin. And, just really enjoyed hearing what he had to say about the soccer culture there. And obviously, too, now you've got Hertha Berlin and you've got Union Berlin in the Bundesliga. So there is a professional soccer culture there as well.
Yeah, I mean, Berlin is a really good one to mention because I think it's, I would say, like, this is a German word, but it's a Sehnsuchtsort. So it's kind of like a place that a lot of people aspire to visit and dream of visiting, or kind of carry around in their hearts. And like you said, it's not, you don't immediately think of soccer because there's so much else going on. But I think it kind of found its place in people's imagination a bit through the Boateng brothers, who grew up in the city and really, learned in those concrete cages that are everywhere, similar to like basketball courts in Manhattan or Brooklyn or the Bronx, any of New York's boroughs, really. You find a lot of small concrete courts like that in Berlin. And especially Hertha in recent years has had a really strong academy. So maybe this is a good, good time for Berlin clubs. And I'm glad that you liked your visit there. I actually really want to go to Alte Försterei, the Union Stadium. That's very high on my list.
Nice. Yeah, and also too, I really do enjoy visiting Dortmund and Schalke and experiencing how hardcore the football culture is there as well, because that's definitely the case. I've spent a little less time at Schalke over the years. McKennie's the main interview. I've done also Matthew Hoppe when he was there. But I did my book that came out a couple years ago about sort of the craft of soccer, position by position, and some of the characters were Christian Pulisic had a chapter in the book, so I spent time with him in Dortmund. Chicharito Hernandez I visited when he was at Leverkusen, and so that whole area there I like as well, but like it's definitely got a different flavor too than other parts of Germany.
Yeah, that's actually where my family's from. So my parents are from, and my grandparents are from like the Ruhr Valley, the industrial part, like where Dortmund, Schalke, and Bochum are located. And I can't believe that 2 out of those 3 clubs are currently in the Bundesliga, and Schalke is not one of them.
Right. Yeah.
But actually, like, I think that's a good talking point, because you say you've spoken with Matthew Hoppe and Weston McKennie, and I guess to me it would be odd growing up in Texas and California and then moving to like a post-industrial city with like high unemployment and lots of air pollution and probably everyone's least favorite Western European language. So I think I guess I'm putting myself in the shoes of like a 16-year-old youth national team player. I mean, not in the case of Hoppe, because he had that really interesting alternative path, but definitely Weston McKennie. And, you're having these offers, maybe touring the Premier League, touring La Liga, Italy, and then you end up at Schalke. I mean, did you talk a little bit about them, their life kind of off the pitch and how they're coping and how they're integrating? Because I would imagine that that's probably not very easy for an American teenager, whether a footballer or not.
It is interesting, and I've had Weston McKennie tell me before that Christian Pulisic, he feels, really set the stage for so many more young Americans to want to go to Germany instead of other countries. The soccer culture was right at the top, and yes, the language adjustment was not always the easiest, but certainly not impossible to deal with. And there's a real desire in this current young generation of U.S. national team players that they want to get to the top of this sport, and they understand that you're going to make some personal sacrifices to do that. And so where you're living, like they just want to play soccer and get really good. And, eventually they may want to go to the Premier League, but they also know how difficult it is to go directly to the Premier League and get a starting role or a playing role, because there's so much money in the Premier League now that even top young English players like Jadon Sancho and Jude Bellingham, they go to Germany now because that's where they can make a name for themselves and then maybe eventually go to the Premier League. So I think American players are looking at it in a similar way, and they're willing to make personal sacrifices. By the way, if you're from Southern California, they got pollution there too. So it's not like Matthew Hoppe hadn't dealt with that before, but I have noticed just how common it is that these U.S. players refer to what Pulisic did and the pathway he had as the one they want to follow. And I guess where it's changed a little bit in recent years is now you're starting to see American players then go from Germany to Italy and Germany to Spain, like Hoppe. McKennie went to Italy. Like, there's been more American players going to Germany over the years than to Italy or Spain. And maybe that's starting to change a little bit. We just saw Brian Reynolds get sold from FC Dallas directly to Roma. So I guess I'm curious to see how Italy impacts things in terms of maybe stealing the U.S. players who might have gone to Germany otherwise moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I do recall vaguely someone asking that, maybe on Twitter, or I'm like, there's so many questions on the right here, so I'm struggling to keep track. But because we did mention the Premier League, which is, the flagship European league, the most glamorous, at least in the last 5 years or so, we do have a question here that's getting some upvotes from Gary the Gooner. So I'm sure everyone can guess which team he supports. What do you make of this one?
Is there a different attitude with soccer owners in the U.S. than those in the Premiership? Definitely a different attitude. I mean, there are some soccer owners in MLS who are also owners in the Premier League, right? So Stan Kroenke is certainly one of those. But owning Colorado Rapids and Arsenal. But being an owner in MLS is very different from being an owner in the Premier League, in the sense that there's no relegation in MLS, and that has a pretty big impact on things, obviously, that Revenues are much more predictable. They're certainly not as high as they are in the Premier League, but you don't have a chance of falling out of MLS. I find it interesting, just sort of the economics recently, where Newcastle United just sold for, I think it was around 400 million US dollars. And there are MLS teams right now that are currently valued at twice that, like $800 million, if you follow valuations in places like Forbes and Sportico and other sports business journals. That doesn't necessarily mean those MLS teams would sell for 800 million, but that's certainly the implication. And so I think a lot of people question, like, well, how is that possible when MLS teams, the actual revenues that they're getting are so much lower than in the Premier League? And it all comes down to a couple of things. You can't be relegated in MLS, and a lot of those valuations for MLS teams are real estate. So that includes the stadiums themselves, and training facilities, things like that. And so I just find that to be an interesting quirk, but it also is why, for example, the European Super League was proposed even before it died a quick death. The whole idea of the European Super League was controlling revenues more. And so for 15 clubs in Europe, they were always going to be in the Super League. They never had to worry about having a bad season on the field and dropping out of the Super League. I also thought it was interesting the Super League wanted to control costs. They were going to agree to a salary cap, at least in terms of what percentage of revenues they would agree to spend on players. I know the Liverpool owners, who are American, by the way, were big behind that. So it's just very interesting to me. And yet at the same time, the Premier League right now is miles beyond any other league in the world, domestic league, in terms of how much money they're getting for television. And so as a result, if you're a team at the bottom of the Premier League, you have as much spending power as most of the biggest clubs on the European continent. And that certainly had a big impact on the transfer market.
Yeah, I mean, and that affects a lot of American talents as well. You know, we saw that with Josh Sargent joining the Premier League. What I always find entertaining is when players from like high quality, you know, represented in European competition, lots of international players on their squads, high quality European continental side, then join teams fighting relegation in the Premier League. I mean, that's just like Leon Bailey. I mean, okay, Aston Villa, that's a bit harsh, but
right. But you're right. I mean, like it's pretty crazy at this point. And you know, like there, you also take a risk a little bit. You know, Josh Sargent has joined Norwich City, and Norwich City looks like it may be the worst team in Premier League history at this point. So we'll see if they stay up. I doubt they will. And then maybe Josh Sargent makes another move. Who knows? But it's a strange economy these days, where it's almost it seems like winner take all to some extent, at least at the very highest end of the spending scale.
Definitely. We got James Barajas asking 3 good questions. I like the first one best, so I'll blend it in and maybe we can tackle the first one.
Okay. So the first one, U.S. soccer coaching education, is it holding the U.S. back? I'm not probably the greatest person to answer this one, just because coaching education is not been a huge strong suit or something I've focused on in reporting a lot over the years. But, you know, based on what I do know, there's frustration out there among some soccer coaches in the U.S. in terms of just the ability to get a license and to pay pretty significant costs to U.S. soccer to get a license, to get in, to be allowed into the program, because they do turn away people. And just, I think the cost is sort of emblematic of a lot of the concerns in American soccer. Just, this sport is supposed to be the simplest sport. It shouldn't cost much to play. It shouldn't cost much to become a coach. And yet it does. And so I think this is a part of what we're talking about. And, there's other aspects of coaching education, I think, too, when you see how few women are in the sort of elite coaching license courses. And I know Jill Ellis has a fund in her name that's hoping to turn this around. And so this is a process that's going to take a while. But I know when they post pictures of the pro license course people, it's almost always all men. Maybe you'll get a Jill Ellis in there every once in a while. But I do feel like from a gender perspective, when you look at other pro sports in the United States right now, including like the NBA, but other sports, that we're behind in soccer in the US in terms of having women who are getting opportunities to coach professional teams on the men's side.
Yeah, we gotta. I think you upset someone in yellow and green over here.
That's okay. That's okay. Don't hate me. I'm a Norwich fan, and I'm glad to see them in the Premier League, and they have plenty of time to get back out of the relegation zone.
Yeah. I'm going to blend in a question, and in the meantime, I'm going to pick up my dog. But I thought it might be fun to talk about Weston McKennie because he is one of my favorite players, and he did so well in the Bundesliga. Not just like, oh yeah, this is Gatsby, by the way.
Hey.
He's trying to eat my AirPods. But yeah, he did so well in the Bundesliga, and I mean, not just as a leader in a really shaky Schalke team, but also in the summer of 2020, he was really the first player to make a stance. In the kind of aftermath of George Floyd and everything that happened in the US, and that was really risky. People don't realize that, but actually the DFB, the German Soccer Association, they almost punished him because it was seen as like a political statement. He's had quite the path from being like a military brat growing up in Germany to then living in Dallas, coming back. Now he's at Juventus. But he was in trouble a few weeks ago with the US men's national team. And so I know that you, in your Substack, addressed that, and in the podcast. Actually, I think Landon Donovan, what he said got a lot of traction on your podcast. But yeah, could you kind of fill people in a little bit on that you don't have to go into the details, but then also kind of give your assessment of Weston as like a young individual on the pitch and off the pitch?
Yeah, I mean, I've always enjoyed my own personal experiences with Weston McKennie over the years, and that included visiting him for that video we were talking about earlier, when we basically spent an afternoon together when he was with Schalke, away from the training facility. We wanted to get some video away from the soccer side, and so there was a really pretty park with a lake in it that we walked. We sat down and had a good conversation. And, we've had a good relationship since then. I remember him texting me a photo. His team Schalke was shown a movie about LeBron James's senior year of high school that I was in. And so he was like sending me like pics from it, which was funny. But
that's a very good movie. I saw that too. Yeah.
Thank you.
In Ohio.
And then, and then, so it's kind of a bummer for me because like everything had been going so well for him in terms of his career progression, to go on loan to Juventus, where I think there were questions about, is he good enough for Juventus? Are they going to want to make the loan a transfer and make it permanent? And he proved himself, and they did buy him. And so that was last season was a good season for Weston McKennie. And, the tough thing is he's gotten into trouble once at Juventus for organizing a party against the police's COVID rules and getting caught and getting a suspension from Juventus, having to pay a fine. It's clear that his teammates really like Weston McKennie, so he's viewed as very positively within the team, and that's the same with the U.S. men's national team. He's vocal, he's liked, he's a good player, and yet, as was the case with this situation last month where he got sent home from the U.S. camp, he has this tendency to break rules, and that is something that you really don't want to make a pattern of. So I've been covering the U.S. men's national team for 25 years, and there's never before this been a player sent home in the middle of a camp with important games for disciplinary reasons. So he was called back in for the games this month, played in 2 of them, played all right. I thought he was a positive, and they US won both of those games, so I think that's important. And based on my reporting from talking to other players in the camp, Weston McKennie was back to being Weston McKennie. He was organizing a pool tournament for the players in Austin, Texas, where Chris Richards told me West basically took everyone's per diem money, and and then very much a part of the team, when it got to Columbus as well. The one thing Weston McKennie's still not doing and hasn't been doing is media interviews. And it's noticeable because he's typically doing a lot of them. And he's always in the past been front and center, US soccer has made him front and center. But because of COVID, we don't have post-game mixed zone interviews where all the players have to walk through. And instead, they're all Zoom interviews post-game. And so Weston McKennie just doesn't want to do it, so he's not doing them. And there's never really a place where the journalist can even ask him if he wants to talk, where he would be walking by in a mixed zone. So I'm curious to see how much longer he maintains his silence with the media, because I thought during this window, Weston McKennie would address what happened publicly and move beyond it. And instead, he has decided not to address it publicly, but that means the questions are still going to be there for him until whatever day he does decide to talk to the media again.
Yeah, we got a kind of follow up here from Steve. And this is a hot take, I guess, but Weston McKennie, even when he was at Schalke, always spoke about England. I think so many players do. That doesn't necessarily make him stick out. But I lived in Rome for a few months, and Italy is a pretty nice place to be making money. And there's a lot of American money being injected into Serie A as well. What do you make of this? Do you see his future Premier League bound, or do you think he should stay put?
It's an interesting question, because when you're at Juventus, it's pretty hard to go up in Italy, right? And Wes is, I think, still just 22 years old. So, I guess the question then becomes, if you're talking about the Premier League, where would he potentially go? From a financial perspective, most of the Premier League teams could afford him. But in terms of soccer, if you were him, how many Premier League teams would you be interested in? Would you entertain the idea of going to a mid to lower level, Premier League team or lower table? I don't know. It also depends how much Juventus wants to use Weston McKennie, and that's up in the air a little bit this season, more so than last season. He was a regular player for them last season. You get the sense that Allegri maybe is not as big a fan of McKennie as Pirlo was at Juventus. Yeah. And so that's going to have an impact on his future. But I know a lot of these US players like the Premier League and wouldn't mind going to the Premier League. And McKennie's style of play, I think, broadly fits what we see in the Premier League.
Definitely. Now, I've kept you 5 minutes longer than I promised, but I have one very important closing question. This is hinting at what you were saying earlier on Twitter, again from James.
It is crazy because like I went like 10 years without consuming a Red Bull. And so having to pull these all-nighters for the first time in forever for every U.S. men's national team game. And so unfortunately, I've had to go back to the Red Bull just to get through the nights. And so I never do more than two. If I like more than two is like, I think I did that one time many years ago, and it was like 6 a.m. I'm actually trying to sleep, and I can hear my heart pounding like in the bed under the sheets, and I'm like, I don't want to go through this ever again. So I don't ever have more than two, but usually it's two. So I have had 6 Red Bulls in the last week for the 3 games, and I probably should go a few weeks now without consuming another one.
Fair enough. Yeah. Grant, thank you so much for being here. I'll leave you to go to the fridge for another Red Bull. Is there anything you'd like to plug? Anything you'd like to tell our listeners? You did get a new job recently. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, I'm staying busy. I just signed with CBS Sports, which is getting big into soccer, and so I'll be doing television appearances for them, which I was doing this past week at the U.S. home games, and I'll be doing documentary films on soccer with CBS. So I'm excited about all those things. My podcast, Futbol with Grant Wahl, just partnered with Meadowlark Media, which is run by John Skipper, the former ESPN president, and Dan Lebitard. We're going to be doing some film projects with them as well, which I'm excited about. And then all my writing is now at grantwahl.com. So it's a subscription site, but there you can sign up for free posts, and if you want to get all my posts, you can sign up for a paid subscription. And when you sign up, you get all of my posts go straight to your inbox, your email inbox. So that makes it easy.
Excellent. Well, dankeschön. Thank you. And this was a lot of fun for me, and thanks for everyone for joining.
Thanks so much, and good luck with everything you're doing, Marie.
Thanks.